objects are stolen, about half are later recovered. Much of the museum is destroyed or burnt. And actually, despite the museum staff running out and sort of begging the US soldiers to come and protect it, they refused. In the library, I think this is probably even worse, really, what happened at the library. Looters and arsonists sort of ransack the building. They lose 60% of their archival material, 25% of their books, newspapers and rare books, and most of its historical photographs and maps. And I think as scholars and academics and so on, we can recognise the tragedy of destroying museums and destroying libraries. And this archive, the National Library and Archive, contains stuff from the classical Islamic period through the Ottoman period, through the monarchical period, the 1958 revolution, and so on. And really very few foreign scholars and even Iraqi scholars had access to this information, particularly since 1991 and the sanctions that have been happening since then. So that stuff is now lost forever. Indicative, I think, of the US attitude towards cultural history, Donald Rumsfeld quips at the time, "Stuff happens, freedom's untidy. Television is merely running the same footage of the same man stealing a vase over and over." And he ends with, "I didn't think there were that many vases in Iraq," which I think is a really telling kind of approach to the cultural history of Iraq, amongst others. Just briefly, the two further examples that I wanted to mention is also the military bases. A number of coalition bases have been set up at key cultural and historical sites, such as Saddam's palaces, and you can see one example there, government buildings, archaeological sites, historic mosques, the Martyrs Memorial, and so on. Perhaps the most devastating, the site of Babylon, which I showed you earlier, is now a US site. It was for a while a US military base. And they did it's been quite well documented, the damage that they did there. Levelling one part of the site to build a helipad is one example. Digging trenches through the site and using the artefacts and so on that they pulled out to put into sandbags and so on. So the damage that has been done at Babylon alone which is one of the some would argue that one of the key archaeological sites in the world is devastating. There's also been systematic looting, Iraqis and various other foreigners, where there's organised gangs of looters, and we're talking here about sort of 40 guys turning up in jeeps with Kalashnikovs in the middle of night and kind of systematically looting key archaeological sites, particularly in the south of Iraq, and then smuggling these out of the country and many of them ending up in Moscow or London and floated onto the international black market. And of course, probably most of you know that archaeological relics or artefacts lose sort of 90% of their scientific value if they're taken out of context, because it's very hard to contextualise them and to work out where they're from and their relation to that particular environment once they're looted. It's also worth noting that the cultural history of Iraq has been targeted due to the kind of increase in ethno-sectarian tension and violence. These are just two very brief examples. The Shia have targeted Sunni sites, such as bombing this statue of al-Mansur, who was the founder of Baghdad in the 8th century. And the Sunni insurgents have been bombing or targeting key Shia sites, such as the Al-Askari Mosque in 2006, which you may remember, which was a beautiful gold-domed mosque prior to the bombing. And also, I think it's important to note, quite interestingly, that the Iraqi government seemed to have taken a fairly, you may say, negative approach towards the cultural history of Iraq. Predominantly, Iraq is a Shia Kurdish-led state at the moment, so there's sort of attempts, I think, to purge it of its Sunni-dominated past. And one such example is the 2007 idea of the Committee for Removing Symbols of the Saddam Era. And they have the idea of destroying the victory arches amongst other monuments. And Mustafa Kadhimi here, who's the founder of the Iraq Memory Foundation, has been reported to have said that we need to use these two swords as proof to further generations to show what happened to Iraqi people. So I think, again, that theme of, what do we do with our cultural history, even if it is a time of brutality, does that necessarily mean that we, go around tearing it down, officially or non-officially? So I wanted to emphasise now the implications that this may or may not be having on nationalism and democracy in Iraq, And I think that it's interesting to note, and I don't think that it's necessarily causal, but I think that it might be contributive, and this is where I'm sort of going with this, that contemporaneous to this historical, cultural historical destruction, there's been a dramatic decrease in nationalistic sentiment and an upsurge in sort of ethno-religious sectarianism and partisanship and violence and so on. And this has had political ramifications. The politics is increasingly conducted along ethno-religious sectarian lines, despite the initial hopes of the US that more secular nationalistic parties like the Iraq National Accord and the Iraq National Congress would garner popular support in Iraq. That pretty much failed. And no credible secular nationalist political party has since emerged. And indeed, the strength of the two key Kurdish parties and the two key Shia parties really have meant that these groups have wielded the most significant amount of power since 2003. This has had ramifications, I think, in the 2005 elections. Really, it should say none, not few, of the parties ran on a secular or nationalistic platform, and really campaigning across Iraq. There was an idea that the rules had changed, that nationalism was out the window, that everything is going to work according to sectarian lines. And that none of the key parties really bothered to campaign to anyone outside of their respective ethno-religious constituents. So Shia did not try to campaign to Sunni or Kurds, and vice versa. And the results are telling. In the 2005 election, 87% of the 9 predominantly Shia provinces go to the Shia list, 100% in the 3 Kurdish provinces, and 87.5% in the 2 Sunni provinces. So I'll just kind of wrap this up. In times of war and suffering and so on, I think that it's correct to place a lot of emphasis on the loss of life and the need for basic security and infrastructure and so on. But I think that also Iraq does need a sustained campaign to protect and restore its cultural heritage. The cultural heritage is significant even if it's not about nationalism and democracy and so on, because it is significant, a significant and rich cultural heritage in and of itself. Beyond this, whether it be the US or the Iraqi government, perhaps more specifically, I think also have a very difficult task in the idea of rebuilding this less tangible discourses and nationalistic discourses that this cultural history was designed to represent, or has been re-engineered to represent. And I think that obviously is a very difficult and complex process. I think by doing this that Iraq's cultural heritage could be used as a powerful political and discursive tool. I think that to some degree the reign of the Ba'ath and Saddam Hussein emphasised that cultural history can be used to placate ethno-religious sectarianism, and it can also be used to restore and develop nationalism. And I think thirdly that it can also be used to build a more robust and inclusive democratic order. There's a lot of sort of research coming out now about historical memory in Iraq, particularly by Eric Davis, and the role that Iraq's rich and complex history could play in developing historical memory, and then the role that historical memory can play in building, in encouraging diverse debate and discourse amongst the various factions, and in therefore developing and stabilising and legitimating the democratic process in Iraq. So that's it from me.
On ghost